Hello, time for Chapter 2 from Finn Family Moomintroll. Written and illustrated by Tove Jansson and published in this edition by Puffin. Thank you, Puffin. Chapter 2, in which Moomintroll suffers an uncomfortable change and takes his revenge on the antlion, and how Moomintroll and Snufkin go on a secret night expedition. Now there's an asterisk here after antlion, which means look at the bottom where there's more information. It says, in case you don't know, an antlion is a crafty insect who digs himself down into the sand, leaving a small round hole above him. Into this hole, unsuspecting little animals fall and then get caught by the antlion, who pops up from the bottom of the hole and devours them. You can read all about it in the encyclopedia if you don't believe me, says the translator. Well, I do believe her. One warm summer day, it was raining softly in the Valley of the Moomins. So they all decided to play hide-and-seek indoors. Sniff stood in the corner with his nose in his paws, and he counted up to 10 before he turned round and began hunting. First in the ordinary hiding places, and then in the extraordinary ones. Moomintroll lay under the veranda table, feeling rather worried. It wasn't such a good place. Sniff would be sure to lift the tablecloth, and then there he would be, stuck. He looked about, and he caught sight of the tall black hat which stood in a corner. That would be a brilliant idea. Sniff would never think of looking under the hat. Moomintroll stole quietly to the corner, and he pulled the hat over his head. It didn't reach much further than his middle, but he made himself very small and tucked in his tail, and he'd be invisible. He giggled to himself when he heard all the others being found, one after another. The Hemulin had obviously hidden himself under the sofa again. He could never find a better place. Now they were all running about, searching for Moomintroll. He waited until he was afraid that they'd get bored with the search. Then he crept out of the hat and stuck his head through the door, and he said, "Look at me!" Sniff stared at him for a long time, and then he said rather unkindly, "Look at yourself." "Who's that?" whispered the Snork, but the others only shook their heads and continued to stare at Moomintroll. Poor little chap. He had been turned into a very strange animal indeed underneath the hobgoblin's hat. All his fat parts had become thin, and everything that was small had grown big. The strangest thing about it was that he himself didn't realise what was the matter. "I thought I'd surprise you all," he said, taking an uncertain step forward on his long spindly legs. "You've no idea where I've been." "It doesn't interest us," said Snork, "but you're certainly ugly enough to surprise anybody." "You're unkind," said Moomintroll sadly. "I suppose you got tired of hunting. What shall we do now?" "First of all, perhaps you should introduce yourself," said the Snork Maiden stiffly. "We don't know who you are, do we?" Moomintroll looked at her incredulously, but then it dawned on him perhaps this was a new game. He laughed delightedly, and he said, "I'm the King of California." "And I'm the Snork Maiden," said the Snork Maiden, "and this is my brother." "I'm called Sniff," said Sniff. "I'm Snufkin," said Snufkin. "Oh dear, how boring you all are," said Moomintroll. "Couldn't you have thought of something more original?" "Now let's go out. I think the weather's clearing." And he went down the steps into the garden, followed by a rather surprised and suspicious little trio. "Who's that?" asked the Hemulin, who was sitting in front of the house, counting the stamens of a sunflower. "It's the King of California, I think," said the Snork Maiden. "Is he going to live here?" asked the Hemulin. "That's for the Moomintroll to decide," said Sniff. "I wonder where he's got to." Moomintroll laughed. "You really are quite funny at times," he said. "Shall we go and look for Moomintroll?" "Oh, don't you know him?" asked Snufkin. "Yes," said Moomintroll. "Rather well, as a matter of fact." He was thoroughly enjoying the new game. He thought he was doing rather well at it. "How did you come to know him?" asked the Snork Maiden. "We were born at the same time," said Moomintroll, still bursting with laughter. "Oh, but he's an impossible fellow, you know. You can't have him in the house." "How dare you talk about Moomintroll like that?" said the Snork Maiden fiercely. "He's the best Moomin in all the world. We think a great deal of him." This was almost too much for Moomintroll. "Really?" he said. "Personally, I think he's an absolute pest." And then the Snork Maiden began to cry. "Go away," said the Snork. to Moomintroll. "Otherwise, we shall have to sit on your head." All right, said Moomintroll soothingly. "It's only a game, isn't it? I'm awfully glad that you think so much of me." "But we don't!" screamed Sniff shrilly. "Take away this ugly king who runs down our Moomintroll!" And they threw themselves onto poor Moomintroll. He was much too surprised to defend himself. When he began to get angry, it was too late. So when Moomin Mama came out on the steps, he was lying underneath a large pile of flailing paws and tails. "What are you doing there, children?" she cried. "Stop fighting at once." "They are walloping the King of California," sniffed the Snork Maiden, "and it serves him right." Moomintroll crawled out of the scrum, tired out and angry. "Mother," he cried, "they started it. 3 against 1's not fair." "I quite agree," said Moomin Mama seriously. "However, I expect you had teased them. But who are you, my little beast?" "Oh, please stop this awful game," wailed Moomintroll. "It isn't funny anymore. I am Moomintroll, and you are my mother, and that's that." "You aren't Moomintroll," said the Snork Maiden scornfully. "He has beautiful little ears, but yours look like kettle holders." Moomintroll felt quite confused, and he took hold of a pair of enormous, crinkly ears. "But I am Moomintroll," he burst out in despair. "Don't you believe me?" "Moomintroll has a nice little tail, just about the right size, but yours is like a chimney sweep's brush," said Snork. And, oh dear, it was true. Moomintroll felt behind him with a trembling paw. "And your eyes are like soup plates," said Sniff. "Moomintrolls are small and kind." "Yes, exactly," Snufkin agreed. "You are an imposter," decided the Hemulin. "Isn't there anyone who believes me?" Moomintroll pleaded. "Look carefully at me, Mother. You must know your own Moomintroll." Moomin Mama looked carefully. She looked into his frightened eyes for a very long time, and then she said quietly, "Yes, you are my Moomintroll." And at the same moment he began to change. His ears, eyes and tail began to shrink, and his nose and tummy grew until at last he was his old self again. "It's all right now, my dear," said Moomin Mama. "You see, I shall always know you, whatever happens." A little later on, Moomintroll and the Snork were sitting in one of their secret hiding places, the one under the jasmine bush, which was hidden by a curtain of green leaves. "Yes, but you must have done something to change you," the Snork was saying. Moomintroll shook his head. "I didn't notice anything unusual," he said. "And I didn't say any dangerous words either." "But perhaps you stepped into a fairy ring," suggested the Snork. "Not that I know of," said Moomintroll. "I sat the whole time under that black hat we use as a waste paper basket." "In the hat?" asked the Snork suspiciously. Moomintroll nodded, and then they both thought for a long time, and then suddenly they burst out together, "It must be!" and they stared at each other. "Come on," said the Snork. They went onto the veranda and crept up to the hat very cautiously. "It looks rather ordinary," said the Snork, "unless you consider that a top hat is always somewhat extraordinary, of course." "But how can we find out if it was that?" said Moomintroll. "I'm not getting into it again." "Perhaps we could lure somebody else into it," suggested the Snork. "Oh, but that would be a low-down trick," said Moomintroll. "And how should we know that they'd be all right again?" "What about an enemy?" suggested the Snork. Said Moomintroll. "Do you know of one?" "The pig swine," said the Snork. Moomintroll shook his head. "He's too big." "Well, the antlion, then," the Snork suggested. "That's a good idea," Moomintroll agreed. "He once pulled my mother down into a hole and sprayed sand into her eyes." So they went out to look for the antlion. They took a big jar with them. Now, you should always look for the antlion's holes in a sandy place. So they wandered down to the beach, and it wasn't very long before Snork discovered a big round hole and signalled eagerly to Moomintroll. "Here he is," whispered the Snork, "but how shall we lure him into the jar?" "Leave it to me," whispered Moomintroll. Now, he took the jar and he buried it in the sand a little distance away with the opening on top. And then he said loudly, "They are very weak creatures, these antlions." And he signed to Snork, and they both looked expectantly down at the hole. But although the sand moved a bit, nothing was to be seen. "Very weak," repeated Moomintroll. "It takes several hours for them to dig themselves down into the sand, you know." "Yes, but," said the Snork doubtfully. "Oh, it does, I tell you," said Moomintroll, making frantic signs with his ears. "Several hours." At that moment, a threatening head with staring eyes popped up from a hole in the sand. "Did you say weak?" hissed the antlion. "I can dig myself down in exactly 3 seconds. "Oh, you should show us how it's done, so we can believe that such a wonderful feat is possible," said Moomintroll persuasively. "I shall spray sand on you," replied the antlion very crossly, "and when I've sprayed you down into my hole, I shall gobble you up." "Oh, no," pleaded the Snork. "Couldn't you show us how to dig down backwards in 3 seconds instead?" "Oh, do it just here, so that we can see better how it's done," said Moomintroll, and he pointed to the spot where the jar was buried. "Do you think I'm going to bother myself with showing tricks to babies?" said the antlion huffily. But all the same, he could not resist the temptation to show them how strong and quick he was, so with scornful snifflings he scrambled up out of his hole, and he asked haughtily, "Now, where should I dig myself in?" "Right there," said Moomintroll, pointing. The antlion dropped his shoulders and raised his mane in a terrifying manner. "Out of my way," he cried. "I'm going underground, but when I come back I shall gobble you up. 1, 2, 3, and he backed down into the sand like a whirling propeller, right into the jar which was hidden under him. It certainly did only take 3 seconds, perhaps 2.5, because he was so awfully angry. "Quick with the lid!" cried Moomintroll. They scraped away the sand and screwed it on very tightly. Then they heaved up the jar and they began to roll it home, with the antlion inside screaming and cursing, choking with sand. "It's frightful how angry he is," said the Snork. "I daren't think what'll happen when he comes out." "Well, he won't come out now," said Moomintroll quietly, "and when he does, I hope he'll be changed into something horrible." When they arrived at Moomin House, Moomintroll summoned everyone with 3 long whistles, which means something extraordinary has happened. The others arrived from all directions and collected around the jar with the screw top. "What have you got there?" asked Sniff. "An antlion," said Moomintroll proudly. "A genuine, furiously angry antlion that we have taken prisoner." "Fancy you daring," said the Snork Maiden admiringly. "And now I think we will pour him into the hat," said the Snork, "so that he'll be changed like I was," said Moomintroll. "Will somebody please tell me what this is all about?" the Hemulin asked plaintively. "It was because I hid in that hat that I was changed," explained Moomintroll. "We worked it out, and now we're going to make sure by seeing if the antlion will be changed into something else as well." But he could turn into absolutely anything," squeaked Sniff. "He could turn into something still more dangerous than an antlion and gobble us all up in a minute." And they stood in terrified silence, looking at the pot, listening to the muffled sounds coming from inside. "Oh," said the Snork Maiden, turning rather pale. Snorks often turned pale when emotionally upset. But Snufkin suggested they should all hide under the table while the change took place, and then he put a big book on top of the hat. "You must always take risks when experimenting," he said. "Tip him in now at once." Sniff scrambled under the table while Moomintroll, Snufkin and the Hemulin held the jar over the hobgoblin's hat. The Snork gingerly unscrewed the lid. In a cloud of sand the antlion tumbled out, and quick as lightning the Snork popped a dictionary of outlandish words on top. They all dived under the table and waited. At first, nothing happened. They peeped out from under the tablecloth, getting more and more agitated. Still, there was no change. "It was all rot," said Sniff. But at that moment, the big dictionary began to crinkle up, and in his excitement, Sniff bit the Hemmelin's thumb, thinking it was his own. And now the dictionary was curling up more and more, and the pages began to look like withered leaves, and between them the outlandish words came out and began crawling around on the floor. "Goodness gracious me," said Moomintroll. But there was more to come. Water began to drip from the brim of the hat, and then to overflow, and then to splash down onto the carpet, so the words had to climb up the walls to save themselves. "Ah, the antlion has only turned into water," said Snufkin in his disappointment. "I think it's the sand," whispered the Snork. "The antlion's sure to come out now." They waited again for an unbearably long time. The Snork Maiden hid her face in Moomintroll's lap. Sniff whimpered in fright. Then suddenly, on the edge of the hat, appeared the world's smallest hedgehog. He sniffed the air and blinked, and he was very tangled and wet. There was dead silence for a couple of seconds, and then Snufkin began to laugh, and in a very short time they were all howling and rolling about under the table in pure delight. All that is, except the Hemmelin, who did not join in the fun. He looked in surprise at his friends and said, "Well, we expected the antlion to change, didn't we? If only I could understand why you always make such fuss about things." Meanwhile, the little hedgehog had wandered down solemnly and a little sadly to the door, and out and down the steps. The water had stopped flowing, and now filled the veranda like a lake. The whole ceiling was covered with outlandish words. When the whole thing had been explained to Moomin Papa and Moomin Mama, they took it very seriously. They decided the hobgoblin's hat should be destroyed. So it was rolled cautiously down to the river, dropped into the water. "Ah, there go the clouds and the magic changes," said Moomin Mama, as they watched the hat gliding away. "The clouds were fun," said Moomintroll rather dejectedly. "I shouldn't mind having them back." "And the flood and the words too, I suppose," Moomin Mama said crossly. "Look at the veranda. I can't think what I shall do with all these little creeping words. They're all over the place. They're making the whole house untidy." "But the clouds were fun anyway," said Moomintroll obstinately. And that night he couldn't sleep, but he lay looking out at the light June night, which was full of lonely whisperings and rustlings and the pattering of feet. The air was sweet with the smell of flowers. Snufkin wasn't in yet. On such nights he often wandered about alone with his mouth organ, but tonight there was no song to be heard. He was probably on a voyage of discovery. Soon he'd put up his tent by the river, refusing to sleep indoors. Moomintroll sighed. He felt sad, but he didn't know why. Just then, a faint whistle came from the garden. Moomintroll's heart gave a bound, and he tiptoed softly to the window and looked out. The whistle meant secrets. Snufkin was waiting under the rope ladder. "Can you keep a secret?" he whispered when Moomintroll had clambered down onto the grass. Moomintroll nodded eagerly. Snufkin leant towards him and whispered again. "The hat has floated to land on a sandbank down the river." "What about it?" asked Snufkin's eyebrows. Moomintroll's ears waggled big. Yes, and the next minute they were creeping like shadows through the dewy garden down towards the river. "You know, it's really our duty to save the hat, because all the water that fills it is red," said Snufkin. "Those who live down the river will be panic-stricken by the awful water." "We might have known something like that would happen," said Moomintroll. He felt very proud to be walking along like this with Snufkin in the middle of the night. Snufkin had always done his night wandering alone before. "It's somewhere here," Snufkin said. "There's a dark streak in the water. Do you see?" Not properly," said Moomintroll, who was stumbling along in the half-dark. "I haven't got night eyes like you." "I wonder how we're going to get it," said Snufkin, looking out over the river. "So foolish of your father not to have a boat." Moomintroll hesitated. "I swim quite well, anyway, if the water isn't too cold," he said. "You wouldn't dare," said Snufkin. I certainly would, Moomintroll retorted, suddenly feeling very brave. Where is it now? Across there, said Snufkin. You'll soon touch bottom on the sandbank. Take care you don't put your foot in the hat. Hold the crown of it. Moomintroll slipped down into the warm summer water and he swam dogwise out into the river. There was a strong current, and for a moment he felt a little bit frightened, but then he saw the sandbank with something black on it, and steering with his tail he soon felt sand under his feet. Is everything all right? Called Snufkin from the shore, and an answering cry came from Moomintroll as he waded out onto the sandbank. There was a dark stream curling out of the hat down to the river. It was the red water. Moomintroll stuck his paw into it and licked it cautiously. Goodness gracious me, he muttered. It's raspberry juice. Just think, from now on we can have as much raspberry juice as we want just by filling the hat with water. And his pee-hoo war cry went out over the river to Snufkin, who shouted back impatiently, Well, have you got it? Oh, yes, Moomintroll shouted, wading into the water again with his tail in a firm knot around the hobgoblin's hat. It's difficult to swim against the current with a heavy hat dragging behind you, and when Moomintroll struggled up the bank, he was terribly tired. Can I show you the picture? Love that picture. I don't know if you could see it really. You might have to see if you can get hold of the book so you can really enjoy the illustrations, because they are wonderful. I can see Snufkin standing on the bank with his hat on. I can see Moomintroll still in the water making his way towards him, and all the roots and shoots. There's creatures watching as well if you look. Here it is, he puffed proudly. Fine, said Snufkin, but what do we do with it? Well, we can't keep it in the Moomin house, said Moomintroll, nor in the garden. Someone would find it. So at last they decided on the cave, but not to let Sniff into the secret, although it was really his cave, because he was rather a small person for such a big secret. You know, said Moomintroll seriously, it's the first time we've done anything that we shouldn't tell Mother and Father about. Snufkin took the hat in his hands and began going back by the river. When they came to the bridge, he suddenly stopped. What is it? Whispered Moomintroll in alarm. Canaries. Snufkin burst out. 3 yellow canaries there on the bridge. How strange to see them out at night. I'm not a canary, peeped the nearest bird. I'm a roach. We are respectable fishes, all 3, his friend twittered. Snufkin scratched his head. There. You see what the hat's getting up to, he said. Those 3 little fishes were swimming in it, I'm sure. They were changed. Come on, we'll go straight to the cave and hide the hat. Moomintroll kept close behind Snufkin as they went through the wood. There were rustlings and patterings on both sides of the path. It was almost a bit frightening. Sometimes small, glittering eyes stared at them from behind trees. Now and then something called to them from the ground or from the branches. A beautiful night, Moomintroll heard a voice right behind him. Fine, he answered bravely. A small shadow slunk past him in the dusk. On the beach it was lighter. A pale blue shimmer hung over the sea and sky, and far out the birds cried their lonely cries. Night was already over. Snufkin and Moomintroll carried the hobgoblin's hat up to the cave and put it brim downwards in the furthest corner so that nothing would be able to fall into it. Now we've done the best we can, said Snufkin. Imagine if we could only get those 5 small clouds back. Yes, said Moomintroll, who stood in the opening of the cave looking out at the sea. I wonder if they could make it more wonderful than it is, though, just now. That's the end of chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back soon with chapter 3. But until then, see ya. Bye.